Somewhere in the ruins of a library that no longer exists, there was a manual for building wealth. Not a metaphor for a manual. An actual, coherent, systematic set of instructions, written down, studied, practiced, and passed between people who understood exactly how prosperity moved through a life and why it refused to move through others. That manual existed in multiple forms, across multiple civilizations, in multiple languages. And then it was gone. Not lost, gone. There is a difference between a thing that disappears and a thing that is removed. You already know, instinctively, that some information carries a cost for the people who benefit from your not having it. You have suspected this. You have felt the outline of it without being able to name the shape. Here is what nobody has told you directly. The framework you were handed for building a financial life, the one taught in schools, repeated by employers, echoed by every conventional voice around you, is not a complete framework. It is a partial one, and the part that is missing is not missing by accident. What you are about to hear is not theory. It is not spirituality dressed as finance. It is a recovered code, specific, structured, old in origin but fully operational right now in your life, in your actual financial decisions starting today. By the time this book ends, you will not be the same person who pressed play, not because something was added to you, because something was returned to you that was taken before you ever had the chance to use it. The library was always open. You just were not told where it was. Chapter 1. They removed the wealth manual before you arrived. Something has been erased. Not from a single place, not in a single moment. It happened slowly, across centuries, the way a river reshapes a canyon wall, so gradually that the people standing at the bottom barely notice the stone is gone until the light stops reaching them. Every civilization that left records behind also left traces of something else, a framework, a set of instructions for how a human being relates to resources, to creation, to the accumulation of life energy in material form. These frameworks were not myths. They were not prayers. They were working systems, refined over generations, passed between the people who understood that prosperity is not luck. It is a readable code. And here is the part that should stop you cold. That code was removed from the version of the world they handed you, not because it does not exist, because it was never included. You did not miss a class. You were handed a curriculum with the most important chapter already torn out. That changes everything about the question you have been asking yourself. The question of why, no matter how hard you work, the number never seems to move the way it should. Hold that question. We will come back to it. But first you need to understand the shape of what was taken. Picture a building filled with scrolls, not a metaphor, an actual place filled with actual knowledge that burned. Most people know the name of that library. What most people do not know is that the burning was not the real loss. Physical fire destroys copies. What destroys knowledge is the decision, made by the people who control education, about which ideas get passed forward and which ones get quietly set aside. The Library of Alexandria contained writings on mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, and architecture. Scholars who visited before it was lost wrote about the breadth of what was held there. But buried inside those same accounts, mentioned briefly, referenced in corners, were entire schools of thought dedicated to what we would now call the mechanics of material creation, the relationship between human consciousness and the accumulation of resources. not as a spiritual exercise, as a practical operating system. Those writings did not make the cut. Not because they were disproved, not because someone tested them and found them false. They did not make the cut because the institutions that reconstructed Western knowledge had a different set of priorities. What survived was what those institutions found useful. What was set aside was what they found threatening or simply irrelevant to the kind of human being they wanted to produce. This is not a conspiracy. A conspiracy requires intent and coordination. What happened here is something more ordinary and more pervasive. It is called cultural selection bias. It works exactly the way biological selection works in nature. The traits that serve the current environment get passed forward. The traits that do not simply stop being taught. The current environment for the past several hundred years has not needed you to understand how to generate wealth from the inside out. It has needed you to generate wealth for someone else, reliably, on schedule. And for that purpose, the curriculum you received is perfectly designed. Picture the life you were living before these last 3 years unfolded, without polishing the memory. Not in terms of achievement, in terms of belief. What did you understand 3 years ago about why some people seem to attract resources almost without effort while you were doing everything you were told to do and still feeling the ceiling above you? Did you have a language for that gap, a framework for understanding it? Or were you working inside a system of explanations that had been handed to you whole, fully assembled, the box already sealed before you opened it? That sealed box is what this chapter is about. There was a man named Callan who grew up in a house where money was discussed the way weather is discussed, as something that happened to you, not something you participated in. His father worked in a textile warehouse. His mother kept the books for a small dental practice. Both of them were careful, responsible, and perpetually 2 bad months away from a crisis. Callan was smart. He went to school, studied hard, graduated with decent marks, and entered the workforce with what he believed was a complete picture of how financial life worked. You earn, you save, you wait. He did all 3. By 31, he had a savings account that felt meaningful and a salary that had grown steadily. And he also had a feeling he could not name, a low hum of wrongness, like he was building something in a room where the walls were slowly closing. One evening, he found a box of his grandfather's papers while clearing out a storage unit. His grandfather had emigrated from Cyprus in his late 20s with almost nothing and died having built, from scratch, a small but stable property portfolio that had supported 3 generations. In that box was a notebook. Not a business notebook, a personal one. Inside it, his grandfather had written, in a combination of Greek and English, a set of principles he called his working rules. Not rules about saving or investing, rules about attention, about where he placed his focus during the day, about the specific quality of mind he brought to decisions, about what he called feeding the field before you harvest it. Callan read it once and set it aside, assuming it was cultural or religious sentiment. Then, 6 months later, at the bottom of the same box, he found a second notebook. This one contained his grandfather's financial records from the first 10 years. Every decision, every property, every number. What he saw in those numbers matched the principles in the first notebook exactly, not as philosophy, as operational sequence. His grandfather had not been lucky. He had been running a system no one had ever mentioned in any classroom or financial course Callan had ever attended. That system was old, much older than his grandfather. What 𝗓𝗠𝗧𝗔𝗡 grandfather had written down, in plain and unpretentious language, was a fragment of something that predates the modern financial world by thousands of years. Every ancient culture that developed lasting material sophistication also developed a corresponding framework for the inner mechanics of resource creation. The Egyptians encoded it in their teachings on creative principle. The Vedic tradition housed it in concepts so layered that Western translation stripped out the practical instruction and left only the metaphysical surface. The Hermetic schools of late antiquity passed it between initiates not because it was secret for secrecy's sake, but because the mainstream educational systems of their era had no container for it. The knowledge was not occult because it was magical. It was occult because it was inconvenient. Suppressed does not mean gone. This is the first thing you need to hear. The fact that something was removed from your education does not mean it was removed from existence. The library was always open. The knowledge did not burn. It migrated. It moved into corners, into traditions, into the personal notebooks of emigrants and craftsmen and merchants who never went to school but built things anyway. It moved into the oral traditions of cultures whose material practices were too easily dismissed by the institutions doing the selecting. And it moved into a field of accumulated human understanding that is older than any library, older than any tradition, older than any written language. Soon, you will run into an idea about where wealth knowledge actually lives that pushes directly against the usual belief. After that clicks, it reshapes how you act every single day. But for now, stay with the shape of what was taken. What you were never taught about wealth was not absent from history. Read that again. It was not absent. It was curated out of your curriculum. The decision about what to include in your financial education was not made by people who wanted you to thrive independently. It was made by people, and by systems built by people, who needed a particular kind of human output. The most efficient way to produce that output was to hand you a framework where wealth is external, where it originates outside you, where your job is to chase it with better habits and harder effort and smarter investment vehicles. That framework is not entirely false, but it is radically incomplete. The missing piece is not obscure or complicated once you know how to look for it. The code exists. It has always existed. It was written before your grandparents were born, before their grandparents were born, in the accumulated record of every human mind that ever wrestled with the question of how a life expands. You were handed an incomplete map and told it was the whole territory. The question is not whether the rest of the map exists. The question is whether you are ready to read it. Chapter 2: The Map That Stops Too Soon. You already believe the right things about money. That's the problem. You believe in saving a percentage of every paycheck. You believe in compound interest in diversified portfolios and not spending more than you earn. You believe hard work precedes reward. You believe in the system. Most people who are struggling financially believe every single one of those things, word for word, deeply and sincerely. And here is what nobody in a suit on a stage has told you: those beliefs are not wrong. They are incomplete, not slightly incomplete, half the map incomplete. You have been navigating the most important terrain of your life with directions that cut off exactly where the real territory begins. This chapter will show you where the map ends, and once you see the edge, you will not be able to unsee it. The chapter you just finished ended with a question hanging in the air, not whether the rest of the map exists, whether you are ready to read it. So before anything else, here is something that will follow you through the rest of this book like a thread pulled through a dark room. Why do some people apply identical financial strategies and arrive at completely different outcomes? Same budget, same discipline, same starting salary, wildly different lives 10 years later. Hold that question. The answer is not what you expect. Now, let us be honest about what conventional financial advice actually does well. Credibility requires fairness. The last thing you need is another voice that dismisses everything you have already learned. Budgeting works. When you tell your money where to go before the month begins, you stop bleeding from 100 small wounds you never noticed. That is real. Compound interest is one of the most reliable mechanical forces in personal finance. Time plus consistent contribution plus reasonable return equals a number that surprises people who never trusted arithmetic. Index funds, emergency reserves, debt reduction. These tools have moved real families from fragile to stable, from anxious to functional. The conventional financial framework built its reputation on those results. The reputation is earned. So when someone tells you that wealth advice is lying to you, they are usually wrong. What they mean, if they are being precise, is that wealth advice is telling you the truth about one layer of reality and saying nothing about the other. Think about a river. You can study the surface of that river. You can measure its width, its speed, the debris it carries, the way it curves around rock. That knowledge is useful. You can build a bridge using only what you can see from the bank. But beneath the surface there are currents you cannot see from above. Pressure gradients, thermal layers, the geology of the riverbed shaping everything that happens at the top. A boat that ignores those currents will fight the river every single mile. A boat that reads them will travel the same distance with a fraction of the effort. Conventional financial advice teaches you to build the bridge. Nobody teaches you to read the current. Here is where the tension lives for most people in your position. You are not lazy. You are not financially illiterate. You have probably read the books, followed the budgets, done the sensible things, and you still feel like you are running against resistance that nobody else seems to feel. Like your financial life has a ceiling that retreats every time you get close. Like the math should be adding up differently than it does. That feeling is not a personal failure. That feeling is what it feels like to navigate with half a map. You are not bad at the destination. You are missing half the directions. Revisit the life you were living before these last 3 years unfolded without polishing the memory. Not in theory, actually pause and place yourself there. What were you earning? What were you spending? What were you hoping for? Now look at the distance between that version of you and where you sit right now. If that distance is smaller than you expected it to be, you are not reading these words by accident. The question most financial educators cannot answer is this: what precedes the physical outcome? Before the bank account changes, something else changes. Before the promotion arrives, something in the structure of your decisions, your attention, your interpretation of what is possible, something reorganizes. Conventional advice treats that reorganization as a nice side effect, a soft skill, a personality trait some people have and some do not. The Akashic framework treats it as the primary mechanism. Here is the distinction that matters. Physical layer work, budgeting, investing, negotiating your salary, cutting subscriptions, operates on what already exists. You are rearranging present resources. That work is necessary. It is not sufficient. The generative layer is where resources originate before they become rearrangeable. It is the set of conditions that determines what options appear in your life, which doors you notice, which conversations lead somewhere real, and which ones dissolve into nothing. You cannot budget your way into options that the generative layer is not producing. You can only optimize what is already arriving. Most people spend their entire financial lives optimizing arrival without ever asking why certain things are arriving at all. A woman named Clara lived in the same city as her colleague Daniel, same firm, same role, same manager. Clara tracked every expense in a spreadsheet. She maxed her retirement contributions at the earliest opportunity. She made no frivolous purchases, took no unnecessary risks, followed every piece of advice she had ever been given with disciplined precision. Daniel tracked almost nothing. He was generous to the point of carelessness with small amounts. He spent money on experiences that produced no measurable return. He invested inconsistently, sometimes aggressively, sometimes not at all. 10 years passed. Clara had built something solid and respectable. Daniel had built something that confused people who watched it happen. He had not been reckless. He had not been lucky in any single dramatic way. He had simply been operating from a different set of assumptions about what money was and where it came from. Not assumptions about discipline. Assumptions about origin. About what the act of generating wealth actually required at its source. Clara was an excellent manager of what arrived. Daniel had been, perhaps without knowing it, a student of what caused things to arrive. That is not an argument for carelessness. Read that again slowly. That is a description of two different layers of engagement with the same financial reality. The conventional map ends at accumulation. Earn more, spend less, invest the difference, wait. Those instructions are complete within their own boundary. The boundary is just not the edge of the territory. It is the edge of the visible territory. Beyond it, the Akashic framework begins. Not as mysticism, not as magic, as instruction. As a set of operating principles drawn from the oldest libraries of human understanding. Principles that describe how the generative layer functions, what feeds it, what starves it, and how a person can engage with it deliberately rather than accidentally. The suppression of this knowledge was not accidental either. What serves a scarcity-dependent economy is workers who are excellent at managing what they receive and completely unaware that they could be influencing what gets generated in the first place. Keep people focused on the surface of the river. Keep the curriculum on the bridge. The current knowledge never makes it into the classroom, not because it failed, because its success was inconvenient in the wrong places. Suppressed does not mean gone. The library was always open. The code was never destroyed. It was archived in traditions most people walk past without reading. Embedded in practices most people dismiss before trying, structured in a language that looks like spirituality from the outside and functions like engineering from the inside. Later on, you will run into an idea about intention and wealth that pushes directly against the usual belief. Once you grasp that turn, it reshapes how you act every single day. For now, understand this. You have been doing the work on one half of the equation, diligently, sincerely. The results have been proportional to that half. The Akashic framework is the other half. It does not replace the budget, the investment, the discipline. It precedes them. It is the condition under which those tools produce their full effect, instead of the diminished, frustrated, ceiling-hitting effect you have been living with longer than you should have. The map you were given was real. It was just drawn by people who had never crossed the river. What if the crossing was always the point? Chapter 3. The Akashic field is not where you think. Crossing is always the point. That sentence from the last chapter is not a metaphor about courage. It is a precise description of how access works. What you are about to hear will either confirm something you have quietly suspected, or dismantle something you were confidently wrong about. Either way, pay attention. The Akashic field is not above you. That idea sounds wrong at first. Every tradition that ever named this field pointed upward, to the heavens, to a cosmic library, to some vast external archive where every event in human history is stored behind doors you have to earn the right to open. It sounds wrong because that story is the one you inherited. But here is the harder truth. The field is not somewhere you travel to. It is something you are already inside. The question is not how to reach it. The question is why you keep insisting you are separate from it. That distinction between reaching for something and recognizing you are already in contact with it is the entire mechanism this chapter is going to hand you. Call up the life you were living before these last 3 years unfolded without polishing the memory. Not just physically. Think about what you believed was possible for you. Think about the ceiling you could feel but not see. And think about what information, what contact, what signal you were receiving every single day that you had no framework to interpret. The field was active. You were in it. You just did not have the language to read what it was sending. Here is a question that has no comfortable answer. What if the reason you have not accessed the wealth intelligence this book describes is not lack of effort, but lack of the right model of where the information actually lives? Hold that question. It will resolve before this chapter ends, but the resolution only makes sense after you understand the mechanism. Dr. 𝗓𝗓𝗧𝗔𝗡𝗧 spent 11 years as a theoretical physicist at a research institute in Vienna. Her specialty was quantum field coherence, specifically, how fields at the subatomic level carry information across distances without direct physical transmission. She was, by every professional measure, a rigorous skeptic. She had built her career on falsifiability. She did not believe in things she could not measure. When a colleague handed her 𝗜𝗏𝗓𝗡 Laszlo's work on the quantum vacuum and what Laszlo called the Akashic field, she read the first 20 pages and set it down with a kind of polite contempt she would later feel embarrassed about. She picked it up again 3 years later, not because she had become less skeptical, because she had run into a problem in her own research that she could not solve using the models she trusted. The problem was this. In certain states of quantum coherence, information appeared to be accessible before the conditions that should have generated that information were present. Not transmitted backward in time, that is a misreading, but present, encoded in the field, in ways that suggested the field itself was carrying a record. A non-local, non-linear record of pattern interactions that transcended the timeline of individual events. She called Laszlo. Their conversation lasted 4 hours. What Laszlo described was not mysticism. It was an extrapolation of what quantum field theory already implied if you followed it far enough without flinching. The vacuum field, far from being empty, is dense with information. Every interaction between matter and energy leaves an imprint in this field. Those imprints do not decay. They are encoded permanently in the structure of the field itself, and coherent systems that achieve a certain quality of internal organization can access those imprints. Lena sat with that for a long time. Then she said, "So the Akashic record is not metaphor." And Laszlo said, "It never was. The ancients were describing something real. They just did not have the language of field theory." She published a paper, quietly, in a journal that existed precisely at the edge between physics and consciousness research. The paper received almost no mainstream attention. This is not unusual. As this book keeps moving, you will run into an idea about how suppressed knowledge gets removed from culture, and once you see it, the mechanism will resolve in a way that changes how you decide what to trust, that pushes directly against the usual belief. For now, understand this. What Lena confirmed through a physicist's framework is what you need in order to stop treating the Akashic field as a fairy tale and start treating it as a working description of something you can actually use. The field is not a library in a building somewhere. It is the totality of patterns that all coherent interactions have ever encoded into the structure of reality itself. Every decision made under genuine clarity, every moment of original thought, every real exchange of value between human beings who both meant what they said, every system that worked not because someone got lucky, but because the design was correct. All of it is encoded. None of it has been lost. Suppressed does not mean gone. The patterns are in the field. And the field is everywhere, including here, including in the space you occupy right now, listening to this. But here is where most people who encounter this idea stop making progress. They accept the existence of the field. They nod at the concept. And then they wait. They wait for a download, for a vision, for some sudden flood of information that tells them exactly what to do with their money, their time, their choices. They treat access like a lottery. Either it happens or it does not. Either you are the kind of person who can receive this information or you are not. That is the wrong model, completely wrong. Access is not a lottery. Access is a function of coherence. Coherence is not a feeling. It is a measurable state of inner organization in which the noise in your system drops below the signal from the field. When your internal state is fragmented, anxious, contradictory, pulling in 4 directions at once, you are generating more interference than signal. The field is still transmitting. You are just producing too much static to receive anything through it. This is why the wealth codes embedded in ancient traditions always began with practices of inner stillness. Not because stillness is spiritual, because stillness is the state in which coherence is achievable, and coherence is the technical requirement for access. Think about Marcus, a construction supervisor in his mid-30s who had read every financial book published in the last decade and was still living paycheck to paycheck. He was not unintelligent. He was not lazy. He worked 60 hours a week and had a folder on his phone full of investment ideas he had never acted on. He told a friend once that he felt like there was a signal just out of reach, like a radio station he could almost tune into but never quite lock on. He said this as a metaphor. He did not know it was literal. Marcus started a practice. Simple. 12 minutes every morning before he looked at his phone, before he spoke to anyone, before he let the day's noise in. He sat with his hands open and his breathing slow, and he asked, not prayed, asked for one clear instruction. Not an answer to everything. One instruction for that day. He wrote down whatever came. Sometimes it was obvious. Sometimes it seemed strange. He acted on it anyway. In 9 months, Marcus had moved from hourly supervision to a consulting arrangement that paid him 3 times as much for half the hours. None of it came from a plan he had made. Each step came from a single instruction he had received and acted on before he had time to talk himself out of it. He would tell you the money was not the surprising part. The surprising part was how quiet the process was, how unlike anything he had expected accessing intelligence to feel. The field does not shout. It encodes, and coherent systems read the encoding. This is the part they removed from the mainstream conversation about wealth. Not the saving, not the investing, not the work ethic. Those survived the removal just fine. What got quietly taken out was the understanding that there is a nonlinear layer of intelligence available to anyone whose internal state meets the basic requirement. That requirement is coherence, and coherence is learnable. The removal was not accidental. A population that believes wealth information is only accessible through conventional channels, schools, banks, brokers, approved systems, is a population that stays dependent on those channels. Scarcity is not just an economic condition. It is an information condition. When you believe you have no access to nonlinear intelligence, you make only linear decisions. Linear decisions in a nonlinear economy produce predictable, limited results. The code is not magic. Let that land. The code is instruction. Instruction encoded in the field by every successful, coherent, wealth-generating system that has ever operated in human history. The Akashic record is not a mystic archive kept by celestial librarians. It is the collective memory of what has worked, preserved in the structure of reality itself, available to any mind organized enough to receive it. And your mind can be organized enough. Not someday. The capacity is present now. The only variable is whether you are generating enough internal coherence to drop below the noise threshold. The library was always open. That is not a comfort. That is a demand. It means every moment you spent waiting to be chosen was a moment you spent not choosing yourself. Every week you told yourself that this kind of access was for other people, more spiritual, more gifted, more something, was a week you spent broadcasting interference into a field that was patiently holding your signal for you. The crossing was always the point, and the crossing is not to another place. The crossing is into a different quality of inner organization, coherent enough to hear what the field has always been encoding in your direction. What would you do differently tomorrow if you woke up believing the signal was already there, and the only thing standing between you and it was the quality of your silence? Chapter 4. Ancient cultures had a wealth operating system. Right now, something is draining out of your life that you cannot see on any bank statement. It is not just money. It is the capacity money represents, the options, the breathing room, the ability to say yes to the right thing when it arrives and no to the wrong thing when it demands your compliance. Every week that passes without a working framework for how wealth actually moves is not a neutral week. It is a week where the compounding works against you instead of for you. Here is the part that carries the most weight. The framework exists. It has always existed. Civilizations far older than the one you were born into had already mapped the mechanics of how abundance flows, how it stalls, and how it restores itself. That map was not destroyed. It was removed from circulation. There is a difference. In this chapter, you are going to see exactly what was on that map, not as mythology, not as philosophy, but as a functioning instruction set for how to position yourself inside the current of generative universal principles. That question from the last chapter is still alive in you. What would you do differently if you woke up tomorrow believing the signal was already there? Hold that question. Because what the ancients understood, and what you are about to understand, is that the signal has a structure. Silence is the receiver, yes, but what you tune it to matters just as much. Here is the open loop you will carry through this chapter. Every tradition we are about to examine solved a problem that modern financial culture pretends does not exist. The problem is this: why do some people attract consistent material provision without grinding themselves to pieces, while others work harder and fall further behind? The ancient answer is precise and specific. You will have it before the chapter closes. Let us begin where the stone speaks. The Egyptians did not think about wealth the way your high school economics class described it. They did not see it primarily as the accumulation of surplus. Their entire cosmological framework was built around a concept they called mad. You would roughly translate it as balance, truth, right order. But mayat was not abstract. It was practical. It was the operating principle of every transaction, every harvest, every construction project, every offering made to the Nile before the flood season. When an Egyptian farmer prospered, the priests did not say he worked harder than his neighbor. They said his actions were in right relationship with the forces governing fertility, timing, and exchange. He was aligned. When he suffered loss, the diagnosis was not laziness. It was misalignment, some action, some omission, some attitude of taking without giving back to the cycle that had made the giving possible. That word alignment is used carelessly today. Here it means something precise. The Egyptians encoded their understanding of abundance as a relational dynamic. You did not grab wealth. You stood in right relationship with the conditions that generated it, and wealth moved toward you the way water moves toward low ground. Not because you forced it, but because you removed the obstruction. Bring to mind the life you were living before these last 3 years unfolded without polishing the memory. Not in general terms. Specifically, think about one decision you made back then that felt like it was against your own grain, something you did because you felt you had no other option. Now think about what followed from that decision. Not dramatically, just trace the thread. Because what the Egyptians were mapping, in stone and ceremony and daily practice, was precisely that relationship between inner alignment and outer result. They were not being poetic. They were being precise in a language that had no other vocabulary for describing energetic mechanics. The Vedic tradition goes even deeper into the operating structure of wealth. In the ancient Indian framework, wealth was one of 4 fundamental human aims. They called it artha. But artha was never meant to stand alone. It was one leg of a 4-legged structure that included dharma, which means right purpose or right action, along with kama, which is desire and pleasure, and moksha, which is liberation. The genius of this system is that wealth divorced from dharma was considered inherently unstable, not morally wrong in a religious sense, structurally unsound. Like a building with a foundation on one side only, it will lean. Eventually it will fall. This is the part that should land hard. The Vedic sages were not saying that poor people are more righteous. They were not romanticizing scarcity. Artha was considered essential. Neglecting it was considered a failure of responsibility to yourself, to your family, and to your community. But the sages observed, over centuries of accumulated empirical observation, that wealth built outside of dharmic alignment corroded. Wealth built through exploitation, through suppression of your actual purpose, through chasing the shape of other people's lives, that kind of wealth came with invisible costs. It required escalating effort to maintain. It created a man or woman who had the object but not the condition, who had the amount but not the relationship with the principles that generated it. Here is a parable. A merchant named Priya lived in a coastal city during a time when the spice trade was at its height. She had watched 2 older merchants grow wealthy before her. The first, a man called Bharan, had expanded relentlessly, more routes, more goods, more workers hired at the lowest possible rate, corners cut in quality whenever the buyer could not immediately tell the difference. Within 6 years, Bharan was the wealthiest trader in the district. Within 10, he was in debt, abandoned by his suppliers, and unable to rebuild because no one trusted his word. The second merchant, a woman named Sela, had moved more slowly. She traded only what she understood. She paid fairly because she said fair payment kept the supply chain honest, and an honest supply chain was the most valuable asset in the business. She took on fewer routes than she could have. When the flood year came and destroyed half the warehouses on the coast, Sela lost less than the others because her relationships had depth. People brought her cargo to protect first. By the time the market stabilized, Sela held twice the position she had held before the flood. She had not prayed harder than Barun. She had aligned her actions with the generating principle, and the generating principle had held her when the water rose. There is a beat here worth sitting inside for just a moment. Sela did not have a mystical advantage. She had a structural one, and that structure had a name long before modern business theory tried to rediscover it. Now let us go to the Hermetic tradition, because this is where the language becomes almost frighteningly precise. The Hermetic texts, passed through Alexandria and attributed to a figure called Hermes Trismegistus, contain a principle that has been quoted so many times in half-understood form that most people have lost its actual operational meaning. You know the phrase, "As above, so below. As within, so without." People repeat it as though it is a spiritual bumper sticker, but look at what it is actually saying. It is saying that there is a correspondence between layers of reality. What exists at the level of universal law exists also at the level of personal experience. What is true about how generative force moves in the cosmos is also true about how it moves in your finances, your relationships, your daily decisions. The structure does not change depending on the scale. This is not mysticism. This is a systems claim. It is saying the same operating code runs at every level of the system. In a later section, you will run into an idea about visualization and intention setting that pushes directly against the usual belief. When that point settles, it reshapes how you actually use your attention every single morning. But right now, stay with the Hermetic principle, because it carries something critical for you. If the generating code runs at every level, then the reason wealth stalls in your life is not primarily a surface-level problem. It is not the number on your paycheck, or the interest rate on your debt, or the timing of your career. Those are downstream symptoms. The Hermetic tradition was absolutely clear that you do not fix the downstream by endlessly attacking the downstream. You find where the flow is obstructed higher in the system and you clear it there. Then the downstream corrects itself. Here is the hard question, and here is the open loop closing. Why do some people attract consistent material provision without grinding themselves hollow, while others work harder and fall further behind? The Egyptian, Vedic, and Hermetic answers are three versions of the same answer. Those who provision consistently are in right relationship with the generating principle. They are not chasing a goal. They are not applying more force. They are aligned with the system that produces what they need, and because they are aligned, the system responds to them the way a well-tuned instrument responds to a skilled hand, with resonance rather than resistance. None of these traditions were telling you to stop working. None of them were offering magical bypass. The Vedic sages in particular were adamant that Artha required real action, real skill, real effort in the world. The Hermetic texts described discipline, study, and practice as prerequisites for understanding, not shortcuts around it. The Egyptian priests built the most sophisticated engineering civilization of the ancient world. These were not passive frameworks. They were frameworks that understood something the modern hustle narrative refuses to acknowledge. Effort applied in alignment with generating principles produces exponentially different results than effort applied in misalignment. Same hours, same intelligence, radically different yield, not because of luck, because of the operating code you are running. That code is not magic, it is instruction. The library was always open. These texts were not hidden because they were primitive. They were deprioritized, reframed as superstition, stripped from mainstream education, Because a population that understands how generating principles work is a population that stops outsourcing its wealth intelligence to institutions that benefit from their dependence. Suppressed does not mean gone. The code persists. It has been sitting in open sources, in translation, in museums, in university libraries with public access. It has been waiting not for a password. It has been waiting for the quality of your attention. Abundance in the ancient framework was never a goal to chase. It was a state of alignment with principles that were already generating, already operating, already responsive to those who placed themselves correctly inside their current. The question is not how to accumulate more. The question is, where in the system are you standing, and does that position match the direction the current is moving? If it doesn't, what needs to shift is not your effort. It is your orientation. Chapter 5. The code has 7 layers, you only need 3. Doing less is not laziness. That sounds like the kind of thing someone invents to feel better about doing nothing. It is not. It is what happens when you finally understand how the Akashic Wealth Code actually works. When you stop adding layers to your effort and start locating the 3 layers that carry all the weight. Here is what nobody in any productivity seminar or wealth workshop will tell you. The code has 7 layers. 5 of them are not yours to operate. They run without you. They have always run without you. The moment you try to control them, you break the circuit. The people who figured this out, not famous people, not people with famous names, but the ones who studied the older systems before those systems were scrubbed from common circulation, those people stopped working harder. They worked in sequence, and the sequence changed everything. That word orientation is where the previous chapter left you. Not effort, orientation. Which raises a question you deserve a straight answer to. Oriented toward what exactly? That is the open door this chapter walks through. The code is not a metaphor. It is not a feeling. It is a structure, and like any structure, it has components that must be assembled in a specific order. Pour the foundation after the roof and the building collapses. Not because you used bad materials, but because you ignored sequence. Most people trying to access wealth intelligence are not using bad materials either. They have desire. They have some discipline. They are willing to work. What they are missing is the correct order. And because they are missing the order, they experience the most demoralizing kind of failure, the kind where nothing is obviously wrong, but nothing is obviously working either. Here is what the ancient libraries encoded about this. And here is what was quietly removed from the popular translations. The original keepers of Akashic instruction described 7 distinct layers of what they called the wealth channel. Some of those layers correspond to collective fields, social timing, generational flows, cultural readiness. These are real and they matter, but they are not in your hands. You cannot schedule when a market is ready for what you carry. You cannot force the timing of collective attention. Trying to operate them directly is like trying to pilot the wind. The 5 outer layers are the field's domain, not yours. This is not a limitation. This is a relief once you understand what it means. What is yours, what has always been yours, are 3 layers sitting at the center of the code. 3 layers that, when activated in sequence, pull the outer 5 into alignment automatically. The ancients called this the inner key. The outer layers follow. They respond. That is their nature, but only after the inner 3 are set. Let's give them names you will actually remember. The first is clarity of claim. The second is receptivity posture. The third is aligned action sequencing. Say those to yourself once. Not because repetition is magic, but because the brain holds what it names. Clarity of claim, receptivity posture, aligned action sequencing. Now let's go deep into each one. Clarity of claim is not the same as knowing what you want. Everyone knows what they want. You want financial freedom, stability, maybe a number in an account that lets you breathe. That is desire, and desire is common. Clarity of claim is something more precise. It is the moment you stop wanting the outcome and start declaring the instruction. Think of it this way. The Akashic field, the vast intelligence that encodes all possible patterns of wealth, the field these ancient systems described as a living archive, does not respond to longing. Longing is noise to a field that processes signal. What it responds to is instruction. Not commands issued with arrogance, but precise statements issued with the calm of someone who already understands the system they are working with. A woman named Cressida learned this the expensive way. She had spent 3 years on what she called her vision work, journaling, visualizing, building boards of images that represented what she wanted her life to look like. None of it produced results she could actually spend. She was clear about outcomes. She was vivid about them. But she had no clarity of claim because she was sending longing, not instruction. One afternoon, at the advice of someone who had studied the older systems, she sat down and did something different. She wrote a single sentence. Not "I want to earn 6 figures." Not "I am abundant." She wrote a specific instruction about a specific offer she would make to a specific kind of person, priced at a specific amount, delivered by a specific method. It felt almost embarrassingly plain compared to the vision boards. Within 6 weeks, she had her first client at that exact price. Within 4 months, she had 7. Nothing mystical happened to her circumstances. What changed was the signal she was sending. Precision activated a response that years of general longing had not. Sit with that for a moment before moving on. Clarity of claim is not about asking correctly. It is about being specific enough that the field, or your own subconscious acting as a local antenna for that field, which may amount to the same thing, has something real to organize around. Vague input returns vague output. This is not punishing you. It is reflecting you. Go back to the life you were living before these last 3 years unfolded without polishing the memory. What were you wishing for in general terms? How many of those general wishes resolved themselves? Now think about the rare moments when you were extremely specific, a specific amount of money needed by a specific date, a specific opportunity you named out loud to someone. How did those specific ones go? For most people, the specific ones have a strange habit of arriving, or arriving close. This is not coincidence. This is clarity of claim working even when you didn't know it had a name. Now the second layer, receptivity posture. This is where the counterintuitive truth from the opening of this chapter starts to resolve. Receptivity posture is the internal state you hold after you send your claim. And here is the problem most people run into immediately. The moment after they send a clear intention, they start monitoring for it. They watch. They check. They wonder why it hasn't arrived yet. And that watching, that anxious scanning of the horizon for the ship they sent for, is the exact posture that closes the channel. A posture is not a feeling you manufacture. You cannot fake your way into receptivity posture by forcing positivity. It is built through evidence, specifically, the evidence of what has already arrived in your life. Things you once claimed without realizing it. Things that appeared when you stopped holding your breath. Receptivity posture is the result of trusting the field's timing because you have personally observed that the field delivers. When you don't have that personal evidence yet, you borrow the structure of trust. You act as someone who expects the outcome without performing the expectation. There is a practical exercise embedded in the older texts for building this posture. It is not meditation, though stillness helps. It is deliberate inventory. Each day, you locate 3 specific instances where something you needed arrived without you forcing it. Not dramatic things, small ones. A phone call that came at the right moment. An idea that appeared while you were doing something unrelated. A connection that seemed accidental. You document these not because gratitude is the mechanism, but because repeated documentation rewires the lens you are using to read your life. When you stop reading your life as a series of failures interrupted by rare luck, and start reading it as a field that has been actively responsive to you all along, your posture changes without effort. And that posture is what keeps the channel open after clarity of claim has sent the signal. Before long, you will run into an idea about the relationship between action and result that pushes directly against the usual belief. After that really registers, it reshapes not just what you do, but when and in what spirit you do it. Which brings us to the third layer. Aligned action sequencing. This is the layer most people jump to first because action feels controllable. It feels like responsibility. And the moment you hear aligned action, you might assume this chapter is about to tell you to work less, rest more, wait for signs. It is not. This chapter is telling you something more useful than that. Action taken before clarity of claim is set, and before receptivity posture is established, is what produces the grinding exhaustion you have probably already experienced. Not because the action is wrong, because it is out of sequence. Aligned action sequencing means your actions proceed from your claim, informed by the posture you have built, in an order that moves from the smallest confirming step to the larger commitments. Not small because you are playing it safe. Small because the first action is a signal, not a strategy. It tells the field and tells you that you are in motion, not in waiting. Each action taken from this sequence gathers information and momentum simultaneously. You are not executing a plan. You are navigating a channel that opens as you move. This is what the suppressed knowledge preserved. Not that you should sit and receive, not that you should grind and force. The sequence. Claim first, posture second, action third. The outer layers of the code, timing, collective readiness, cultural flow, begin organizing in response. Not because the universe owes you a debt, but because you have finally stopped introducing interference into a system that was built to work. The code has 7 layers. 5 of them are not your job. 3 of them are, and they require your full attention in a precise order. The library was never locked. The instructions were always there. What was removed was the map that showed you where to begin. Sequence is not strategy. Sequence is the code itself. Chapter 6. Layer 1. Intention must be precise, not greedy. Every moment you carry a vague wish for more money, something specific is draining away. Not dramatically, not with any announcement. Just quietly, the way water finds every crack in a foundation, it seeps out, and you do not notice until the damage is already done. You want financial security. You want relief. You want to stop checking your bank balance at 2 in the morning with that particular sick feeling in your chest. But wanting more is not an instruction. The field, the intelligence this entire code is built on, does not respond to emotion alone. It responds to coordinates. Right now, without precise coordinates, every intention you send is like shouting a destination into the wind instead of entering it into a navigation system. The signal scatters. Nothing locks in. Every week that passes without precision is a week the code sits dormant waiting while you stay exactly where you are. That is not your fault. It is a missing piece of information, and this chapter gives it to you. Sequence is not strategy. Sequence is the code itself. That was where the last layer ended, And it matters here because you are about to discover that within the sequence there is a quality requirement, not just an order. You can follow the steps in the correct order and still produce static instead of signal. The difference between static and signal is a single word: precision, not discipline, not visualization frequency, not the length of your meditation or the force of your desire. Precision. The degree to which your intention can function as a set of coordinates, clear enough to locate something real in the world, generous enough to generate movement beyond yourself. Here is something most wealth teachings never say out loud. The field is not a vending machine. You do not insert desire and receive money. The field is more like a vast, living index. And this book will show you later that the index is far more intimate than you currently believe. But for now, think of it as a system that organizes and surfaces possibility based on the quality of the request it receives. Vague requests generate vague results. Fear-based requests generate more fear-based conditions. And requests so open they could mean anything are treated by the field the same way a search engine treats a single generic word. You get everything and nothing at once. So what does a precise intention actually look like? That question has a specific answer. And to get to it, you need to hear about Solomon. Solomon Reyes had spent 4 years trying to build a business. Not one business, 3. A dropshipping operation that dissolved in month 7. A consulting practice that brought in $1,400 total before he stopped answering emails. And a digital course he never finished recording because he told himself he needed more time to prepare. That was true in the way that most self-deceptions are true. He did need more time, but preparation was not what he was avoiding. What Solomon was avoiding was commitment to a specific thing for a specific person. Every pitch he wrote said some version of the same sentence. He wanted to build financial freedom. He wanted to make enough to quit his job. He wanted to scale his income. Every intention, every goal, every affirmation he wrote in the notebook on his nightstand pointed inward. More for me. Safety for me. Options for me. The field heard it. But what the field surfaced in response were more pathways that required him to fight for safety, more opportunities that demanded proof of his survival instinct, more situations that mirrored the fear underneath the wanting. He was not sending coordinates. He was broadcasting anxiety with a $sign attached. Then one Tuesday evening, after a conversation with his sister that started as small talk and ended in something that cracked him open, Solomon wrote a different sentence. Not an affirmation, a description. He wrote, "I want to build a single online service that helps freelance translators in Latin America find consistent contracts with U.S. agencies, because I know exactly what being underpaid and invisible in that market feels like, and I know what changes when someone finally knows how to be found." He did not write that he wanted more money. He wrote who he was serving, what they needed, and why he was the one to serve it. Within 3 weeks, an email landed in his inbox from a woman in Colombia who had found an old comment he left in a forum 2 years prior. She wanted to know if he did consulting. He had never offered consulting, but the thing she described needing was precisely what he had just decided to build, not approximately, precisely. He did not tell himself it was luck. He had been in that forum before. He had left comments before. People had seen his name before. None of it had ever produced that email. Something in the quality of his intention had changed the way he moved in every room he entered, even the digital rooms he had entered years ago. The field had indexed him differently. It surfaced a connection that was always technically available and had never activated until he gave the code something real to work with. Remember the life you were living before these last 3 years unfolded, without polishing the memory. Not in general terms, specifically. What were you working on, what were you hoping for, and how did you phrase it, even just inside your own mind? Was it specific enough to act on, or was it a feeling dressed up as a goal? Most people, if they are honest, will find a version of the same vague sentence cycling on repeat. More money, more freedom, more breathing room, and the years went by, not because the desire was wrong, because the signal was incomplete. This is the moment the code becomes practical in a way that removes all mysticism from it. Precision is not a spiritual practice. It is an instruction format. When your intention names a specific person who needs a specific thing and positions you as the specific source of that thing, you have written coordinates. You have entered an address, and the field, which is nothing more than the living sum of all available connection and possibility, can now route toward it. Vague intention is not a moral failure. It is a technical error. The remedy is not more feeling. The remedy is more specificity. But there is a second half to this layer that gets skipped almost every time this principle is taught, when it is taught at all. Precision alone is not enough. The intention must also be oriented outward. Not because generosity is a virtue you should perform, because the field moves toward contribution the way water moves toward low ground. It is not metaphor, it is mechanics. An intention that is precisely self-serving produces a closed circuit. Energy goes out, returns, and loops back on itself. You might execute the intention. You might even achieve the specific financial outcome, but the system stops there. There is no compound growth in a closed circuit. There is only the exact return you aimed for, and then silence. An intention that is precisely contribution-oriented produces an open circuit. Energy moves through you and continues moving through the people you serve and back into the field and forward again in forms you did not plan and could not have designed. That is the actual mechanics of how value compounds in any market, in any economy, in any era. Closed systems extract. Open systems build. Every tradition that preserved this knowledge understood this. The library was always open, not the building, the circuit. The information that was pulled from public access, the nonlinear wealth knowledge that this book is recovering piece by piece, was not dangerous because it was magical. It was dangerous because it was structural. It described the operating conditions of wealth generation in terms that had nothing to do with scarcity, competition, or the controlled flow of resources. It described wealth as a responsive field that rewards precise contribution. That is not a comfortable idea for systems built on manufacturing dependency. So the question you now need to sit with is this: what is your current intention and how specific is it? Not your goal, not your dream board. Your intention, the actual sentence, the actual coordinates you have given to the field. Can you name the person it serves? Can you name the specific problem it solves? Can you name why you, with your exact background and your exact experience and your exact history of pain and learning, are the one positioned to solve it? If you cannot answer all three, you do not yet have an intention. You have a wish. Wishes are not coordinates. Wishes are weather. Here is the line that separates them. A wish lives in the future. An intention locates a need in the present. Wishes ask, when will things change? Intentions ask, who needs what I already have? That shift in the question changes everything. It changes where your attention lands each day, what you notice, who you listen to, how you interpret the emails that arrive and the conversations that start unexpectedly and the problems that keep reappearing around you. Those problems are not obstacles. They are the field giving you a map, but only if your intention is precise enough to read it. Solomon's story did not end with one client. It ended, some years later, with a platform that placed over 400 translators into contracts, not because he worked harder than every person who failed, because he gave the field something to work with that was real enough to locate and generous enough to move. Suppressed does not mean gone. The knowledge was always there. The circuit was always open. And the code is not magic. It is instruction. The instruction for this layer is exact. Wealth intentions work when they are precise enough to act as coordinates and generous enough to function as contribution. Down the line in this book, you will run into an idea about where wealth intentions should come from that pushes directly against the usual belief. Once that becomes real to you, it reshapes how you form every intention for the rest of your life. But that resolution depends on what comes next. Because once you have coordinates, the question becomes, how does the field actually receive them? Chapter 7. Layer 2. Receptivity is a skill, not a surrender. Receiving less is not your problem. Receiving wrong is. That sounds backwards, especially when your bank account feels thin and your opportunities feel scarce. But stay with it. Most people spend their entire financial lives broadcasting louder, pushing harder, wanting more intensely. The actual bottleneck is not the signal going out. It is the signal coming in. That distinction, once you genuinely see it, will change the way you spend your energy, for the rest of this chapter and long after it ends. The field has been sending. The coordinates you set in the last chapter are already registered. The only question now, sitting unanswered since the moment you started this book, is whether you are actually built to receive what the field is trying to return. Hold that question open. Do not try to answer it yet. The previous chapter ended on a precise edge. Coordinates exist. The field registers them, but how does reception actually work? Not in a vague metaphysical sense, in a practical, repeatable, mechanical sense. Code is not magic. Code is instruction. And this chapter is the instruction set for the receiver. Think about a radio antenna. Not the sleek digital kind, the old kind, the kind people used to adjust by hand, rotating aluminum arms on a rooftop until the static broke and a signal came clean through. The transmission was always there. The signal did not get stronger when the antenna improved. The signal was constant. What changed was the clarity of the receiver. When the antenna was bent, corroded, or pointing in the wrong direction, the broadcast came through as noise. When the antenna was clean, oriented correctly, and free of interference, the same broadcast resolved into music, into voices, into information. You are the antenna. And right now most people are bent, not broken, bent. There is a difference, and that difference carries hope inside it. Broken means the capacity is gone. Bent means it was there, it has been there, and the only task is correction. The library was always open. The transmissions from the field have been continuous. What got disrupted was not the source. What got disrupted was the receiver inside you, through years of financial stress, cultural noise, and the specific kind of mental static that comes from carrying too much unresolved scarcity thinking in your body every single day. Here is the tension nobody talks about. The same urgency that drives you to want more is the static that prevents you from receiving it. Urgency creates a particular kind of mental frequency, tight, contracted, scanning for threats. A contracted receiver cannot detect a broad signal. This is not a punishment. It is physics. A clenched fist cannot catch what is dropped into it. Now consider Marcus. Marcus was 31 years old, working as a logistics coordinator in a mid-sized shipping company in Cincinnati. He was smart, genuinely competent, and chronically underpaid. He knew it. He had known it for 3 years. Every morning he woke up with the same low-grade pressure behind his eyes, the same calculation running in the background: what I have, what I owe, what the gap is. He had tried side work. He had read the books. He had made the vision boards and said the affirmations, and still, every month, the number in his account hovered at the same altitude, close enough to fine, but never, not once, past a ceiling that seemed to have been installed somewhere above his reach without his consent. One evening Marcus drove to a park near his apartment, not for any particular reason. He was not meditating. He was not journaling. He was just tired of the noise in his own head, and he needed somewhere quiet to sit. He left his phone in the car. He sat on a bench near a small pond, and he did something he had not done in years. He stopped trying to solve the problem, not because he had given up, because he was exhausted. And in that exhausted stillness, a thought arrived that was different from his usual thoughts. It was not loud. It did not announce itself. It arrived the way a name arrives when you stop trying to remember it, quietly, from a direction you were not looking. The thought was specific. There was a niche within his existing company's logistics chain that nobody was managing well, a gap between the freight carriers and the customs documentation side of the operation. He had noticed it for months, but always in passing, too caught up in his own noise to stay with it. That evening, sitting still, he stayed with it. 3 months later, he had designed a process, presented it to his director, and negotiated a raise that moved him out of the zone he had been trapped in for 3 years. Marcus did not receive that idea because the field rewarded his effort. He had been efforting for years. He received it because for one evening he was quiet enough to hear what had already been trying to reach him. That is receptivity, not waiting, not surrendering, not hoping. Deliberately clearing the internal space so that what was already incoming could actually land. Now here is where the conventional advice fails you. Most financial guidance tells you to think harder, plan more, hustle with greater intention. Some of that has value, but none of it addresses the receiver. None of it asks the foundational question. Are you actually clear enough to detect what the field is sending back? If the antenna is full of static, louder transmission only creates louder static. More effort in a contracted state produces more contracted results. This is what was suppressed, not the hustle advice that they kept, because hustle is monetizable, hustle is exhausting, and exhausted people make compliant consumers. What was removed from the mainstream conversation was the receiver side of the equation. Ancient libraries held detailed instruction on stillness, not as spiritual practice for monks, but as a practical technology for anyone who wanted to operate at full capacity. That instruction got labeled mystical. It got filed under religion. It got moved out of the practical wealth conversation and into the corner where people are allowed to believe in things that do not inconvenience the prevailing system. Suppressed does not mean gone. You are holding it right now. Look back at the person you were before these last 3 years unfolded without polishing the memory. Not the big picture, the small daily texture of your mornings. What was the first thought when you opened your eyes? Was it clear, or was it already calculating? Was there even a moment of quiet before the inventory of problems began? For most people in financial stress, the day starts already contracted. The receiver is degraded before 7 a.m. That contracted state carries through the entire day. Every decision, every opportunity, every incoming signal gets processed through static. Receptivity is the practice of interrupting that pattern, not once, not as a grand gesture, as a repeatable discipline built into ordinary time. Here is what that practice actually looks like. Not a meditation retreat, not an hour of silence. Something far more portable than that. Find 2 minutes. Right now if you want, or return to this later with intention. Sit in a position where your back can be straight without effort. Close your eyes if that is safe and available. Take one breath that is longer than your usual breath, not forced, just extended. As you exhale, do not replace the air immediately. Let there be a pause at the bottom of the breath. In that pause, 1 to 2 seconds at most, notice the absence of thought, not the content of thought, the absence. That gap is what you are training. It is small. It will feel insignificant. It is not. That gap is the receiver in its clearest state. No static, no calculation, no inventory of problems, just open channel. Do that 3 times. Most people have not experienced 3 consecutive clear gaps in their mental signal in years. That is not an exaggeration. The noise is that constant, and the field has been transmitting through all of it. Now here is what you need to understand before you dismiss this as too simple. Clarity compounds. 1 clear gap trains your nervous system to recognize the clear state as safe. 2 gaps begins to establish it as a baseline. A week of daily intentional gaps begins to shift the default frequency of your receiver. You do not need hours. You need repetition. Small, consistent, real. A little later, we will get to a point about effort and earning that pushes directly against the usual belief. When that idea snaps into focus, it reshapes how you actually spend your working hours. But that resolution depends entirely on the receiver being clear enough to use it. This is why layer 2 comes before the deeper instruction. You cannot run advanced code on a corrupted system. You build the clear receiver first. Everything that comes after this chapter is meant to arrive into a space that is genuinely open. The open loop you have been carrying since the beginning of this chapter. Whether you are actually built to receive what the field returns now has its answer. You were always built for it. The architecture of reception was never removed from you. It was buried under noise, and the noise was not entirely your fault, and the practice of clearing it is simpler than anyone with a stake in your confusion would like you to know. The library was always open. Your capacity to enter it was always intact. Receptivity is not a personality trait you either have or lack. It is a skill you either practice or neglect. And the difference between those 2 options shows up not in how hard you want things, but in how clearly you can hear what is already trying to reach you. Chapter 8, Layer 3. Action must follow the signal, not the fear. Every moment you spend waiting to feel ready is costing you something you cannot see. Not confidence, not time, something more specific than that. The exact opportunities that move through your awareness every week, the phone call you almost made, the idea you almost acted on, the door that stood open for 72 hours before it quietly closed. Those were not random. They were the field speaking. And without the code to read them, you acted on the wrong things at the wrong times for the wrong reasons. Or you did not act at all. That is the hidden cost nobody names. Not dramatic loss, not catastrophic failure, just the slow, compounding disappearance of possibility, one unconsidered signal at a time. The mechanism causing it has nothing to do with your intelligence or your effort or your desire. It has to do with what you have been trained to respond to. And that training, as you will discover in this chapter, was never designed to serve you. Here is the question this chapter is going to answer. How do you tell the difference between action that builds something real and action that only feels like moving? That question matters more than most people realize. Busy is not productive. Motion is not direction. And the cost of confusing the 2 shows up years later, in bank accounts and opportunities that never accumulated the way they should have. You heard the last chapter end with an important idea. That receptivity is a skill, that the field is already trying to reach you, that the clarity of the signal depends on how well you have practiced receiving it. Now we go one layer deeper, because receiving is only half the work. The other half is knowing what to do with what you receive. This is where most people in the modern world have been left without instruction, not because the instruction does not exist, because it was removed. The ancient libraries, and we are not speaking metaphorically here, we are speaking about actual traditions from pre-Alexandrian schools, from the oral lineages of the Indus and the Nile and the early Mesoamerican knowledge keepers. Those traditions all contained a common teaching. That action is not the first step. That action is the response to a prior signal. That when a human being acts from genuine inner alignment rather than from external pressure or internal fear, the action produces results disproportionate to the effort involved. That is not mysticism. That is documented pattern recognition across thousands of years of recorded human behavior. Suppressed does not mean gone. The teaching survived. It was encoded into stories, into architectural ratios, into musical scales, into the structure of certain prayers preserved inside religious institutions that had forgotten their own origins. What got lost was not the code itself. What got lost was the instruction manual, the plain language explanation of what the code was for. This chapter is part of that manual. There was a woman named Selene who ran a small import business out of a second-floor office in a city she had moved to alone at 26. She had built the business carefully, contract by contract, over 4 years. Then the market shifted. 3 of her 5 major clients restructured their supply chains within 6 months of each other. Her revenue dropped by half. The fear arrived immediately. That is what fear does. It arrives before you have processed the information clearly, before you have assessed your actual options, before you have any real data to work with. Within 3 days of the second client notification, Selene had already drafted 2 proposals for new service categories she had never considered before, had reached out to 14 contacts asking for referrals, and had signed up for 2 industry memberships she did not need. She was moving fast. She was working hard. By every external measure, she was taking action. 4 months later, she had 4 new clients. None of them were right. The contracts were smaller, the margins thinner, the work more draining, and the relationships harder to maintain. She had replaced her lost revenue on paper, but her business felt like it was running in the wrong direction. Then something happened. She was sitting in her office early on a Thursday morning before anyone else arrived, and an idea came to her. Not a panicked idea, a quiet one. It was about a supply chain gap she had noticed 14 months earlier and filed away without acting on because the timing had felt uncertain. She sat with the idea for 20 minutes. She did not reach for her phone. She did not draft an email. She just let it settle. By the end of that morning, she had made 2 phone calls, only 2, to people she had known for years, people she genuinely trusted, people who operated in the gap she had identified. Within 90 days, those 2 calls had produced 1 partnership that tripled her revenue in a category she had never formally entered. The 14 frantic actions from fear produced noise. The 2 aligned actions from signal produced her next chapter. Return to the person you were before these last 3 years unfolded, without polishing the memory. Think about the actions you took in that period, the ones driven by anxiety, by the fear of being left behind, by the pressure of what other people expected. Then think about the quieter moments where something just felt right, where you acted without needing to convince yourself, where the resistance inside you was low, almost absent. Which of those two categories produced the results that actually lasted? That is the mirror this chapter is asking you to hold up. Now here is the test. It is simple. You can use it in 10 seconds or less. When you are about to take any action, one that involves your resources, your attention, your time, or your money, ask yourself one question. Does this action feel like it is opening something or closing something? That is all. Expansion or contraction. Not excitement versus calm. Not big versus small. Opening versus closing. Fear-based action always contracts. It tightens your options. It moves you toward the nearest exit, the fastest solution, the thing most likely to stop the discomfort right now. It spends tomorrow's capital to ease today's anxiety. Signal-based action expands. It moves toward something rather than away from something. It opens a new relationship, a new category, a new understanding. Even when it feels uncertain, it does not feel like you are shutting doors. You can feel the difference in your body. Right now, think of a financial decision you are currently considering. It might be a purchase, an investment, a business choice, a career move. Hold it in your mind for a moment. Now ask, does thinking about taking that action make your chest feel like it is opening or like it is tightening? One of those two sensations is telling you something real. That sensation is not emotion. Emotion can mislead you. Fear feels real. Excitement feels real. The contraction-expansion signal is different from both. It operates at a quieter register, below the noise of what you want and what you are afraid of. When the ancient tradition spoke about the field providing instruction, this is part of what they meant. Not visions, not voices. A directional signal available in the body whenever you are still enough to read it. This is where the deliberate removal of non-linear knowledge did its most quiet damage. The industrialized model of action, do more, move faster, measure output, repeat, drowns out that register completely. It is not necessarily a conspiracy of malice, but it is a system that benefits from your inability to distinguish signal from fear. A person who cannot read alignment takes more frantic action. They consume more products, more programs, more promises of productivity. They stay inside a cycle of motion that never resolves into traction. The code breaks that cycle, and the code is not magic. It is instruction. Specifically, it is an instruction about sequence. The ancient libraries were not teaching people how to want things. They were teaching people how to receive what the field was already transmitting, and then how to act in response to that transmission rather than in response to their own internal panic. That sequence, receive first, act second, is the entire mechanism. When you act from fear, you are acting first. You are trying to create the conditions for the signal to arrive by moving fast enough to catch it. But the signal does not work that way. The signal arrives in stillness. And once it arrives, the action it calls for is almost always more specific, more efficient, and more surprisingly effective than anything you would have generated from panic. Here is something you will encounter later in this book that directly contradicts what most people believe about timing. Most people believe that speed is the advantage. They believe the person who moves fastest wins. What you will discover in the later chapters that deal with the code's third and fourth registers is that the opposite is often true. And once you see why, you will never rush a consequential decision the same way again. Now close the loop on the question we opened with. How do you tell the difference between action that builds something real and action that only feels like moving? The answer is sequence. Real action follows the signal. It comes after stillness, after reception, after the directional sensation in your body has told you which door is open. Action that only feels like moving comes first. It tries to create the signal through effort. It confuses motion for meaning, and it compounds your distance from the results you actually want. This is what separates the people whose efforts accumulate from the people whose efforts evaporate. Not smarter strategy, not better connections, not harder work. Sequence. The fear will always ask you to go first. The signal will always ask you to listen first. And the question you now carry into tomorrow is this: before you take the next action that matters, are you willing to stop long enough to hear what the field is actually asking you to do? Chapter 9. Why modern education closed access to the field. The most effective way to eliminate a technology is not to burn it. It is to make an entire civilization forget it was ever necessary. That sounds like the beginning of a conspiracy. You might already be reaching for your skepticism. Good. Keep it close. Because what actually happened was not a conspiracy, it was an optimization. A system was built to solve a real problem, and in solving that problem with extraordinary efficiency, it quietly erased something older and far more generative. By the time you finish this chapter, you will see exactly how that erasure happened. You will understand why it made sense to the people who built it. And you will see what it cost you personally, not as a vague cultural loss, but as a specific, measurable gap in how you think about creating wealth. There is a reason the access you have been practicing in earlier chapters feels unfamiliar. The unfamiliarity was engineered, not against you, but without you. The question from the last chapter is still sitting inside you. Before you take the next action that matters, are you willing to stop long enough to hear what the field is actually asking you to do? Hold that question. You will hear the answer differently by the time this chapter closes. To understand what was lost, you have to go back to a specific moment in history. Not ancient history. Recent. Uncomfortably recent. In the early 19th century, Prussia faced a crisis that would be familiar to any government leader today. It had just lost badly to Napoleon. Its military was demoralized, its workforce was fragmented, and its economy was inconsistent. The Prussian state needed workers and soldiers who could follow instructions at scale, quickly and reliably, across thousands of different towns and villages. The answer it reached for was education. Compulsory, standardized, government-organized education. Schools that would take children, sort them by age, progress them through defined material, test them at intervals, and graduate them as reliably competent participants in industrial and military structures. This was not malicious. It was rational. The Prussian reformers, Johann Gottlieb Fichte chief among them, genuinely believed they were creating something that would strengthen the nation. They believed they were giving common people access to literacy and civic life they had never had before. In many ways, they were right. Literacy expanded, economic participation broadened, stability increased. But notice what the system was designed to produce: not thinkers, workers, not inventors of process, followers of process. The educational architecture was built around compliance with external instruction, not access to internal generative intelligence. Why does that matter to you right now? Because that Prussian model did not stay in Prussia. It traveled. It became the template that the United States, England, France, and most of the industrialized world adopted as they scaled their own labor forces through the 19th and early 20th centuries. Horace Mann, the Massachusetts education reformer, traveled to Prussia in 1843 and observed the system. He came home admiring it deeply. He described it as the most effective educational structure he had ever seen. He pushed for its adoption, and adopt it they did, with modifications, with good intentions, with genuine belief in its power to equalize opportunity. The system that most people reading this chapter attended traces its direct lineage to that Prussian model. Now couple that with what happened in factories around the same era. Frederick Winslow Taylor was an American engineer who became obsessed with efficiency in the 1880s and 1890s. He studied factory workers, timed their movements, and broke every task into its smallest components. He designed workflows that eliminated wasted motion. His system, which he called scientific management and which history calls Taylorism, produced staggering productivity gains. Output doubled, costs dropped. Managers loved it. But Taylor's system required something very specific from the worker. It required that the worker's judgment be removed from the equation entirely. The worker should not decide how to do the task. The worker should execute the sequence that the manager, the expert, had already determined was optimal. Thinking was not the worker's job. Movement was. You can already see where this is going. The school system optimized for compliance. The factory system optimized for execution without judgment. And because the school system was explicitly designed to produce factory-ready workers, the two philosophies merged into something seamless. Children learned to sit still. They learned to follow instructions. They learned to accept that the authority at the front of the room holds the right answer. And they learned to demonstrate their understanding by repeating that answer back correctly on a test. What kind of intelligence does that train you out of? Travel back 3 years and keep it plain, not geographically, but inside your own mind. Think about what you believed was possible for you financially. Think about where that belief came from. Not what you told yourself it came from. Where it actually, practically came from. Most of the limits you held 3 years ago were not conclusions you reached through experience. They were premises you absorbed without question. The system you grew up inside rewarded absorption over interrogation. That is the mirror this chapter is asking you to hold. What the Prussian Taylorist synthesis could not afford, structurally, economically, practically, was a population trained to access generative intelligence directly. Generative intelligence does not produce predictable output. A worker who is genuinely tuned into something deeper than the supervisor's checklist is an unpredictable worker. An unpredictable worker breaks the productivity model. So the curriculum was not designed to cultivate that kind of access. It was designed to suppress it through substitution. Replace inner listening with outer instruction. Replace pattern recognition with rule memorization. Replace the capacity to sit in uncertainty and receive, the exact capacity you practiced in chapters 6, 7, and 8, with the anxiety of being tested and judged by external criteria. The suppression was not a committee decision. No one sat in a room and said, "Let us prevent people from accessing the Akashic field." The suppression happened because the generative framework and the industrial framework were simply incompatible. The industrial framework had immediate economic incentives behind it. The generative framework did not. Incentives won. They almost always do. Here is what most people never consider about this history. Before this educational architecture existed, the frameworks for nonlinear intelligence were not hidden. They were woven into the fabric of how knowledge was transmitted. Apprenticeship models involved years of observation, intuition, and tacit knowing. The kind of knowing you cannot write in a textbook because it lives in the body and the attention, not on a page. Philosophical traditions across cultures, from Sufi schools in Persia to the Hermetic academies of Renaissance Europe to the contemplative universities of East Asia, treated the cultivation of inner perception as a primary educational goal, not a supplement to learning, the foundation of it. These traditions understood something that Taylor's stopwatch could not measure. The most generative insights do not come from following a procedure. They come from reaching a state of receptivity that linear analysis cannot produce. You cannot schedule that state. You cannot standardize it. You can only cultivate the conditions for it, and then trust it when it arrives. The industrial curriculum had no room for trust as a learning tool. Trust is not measurable. What cannot be measured cannot be optimized. What cannot be optimized has no place in a system built around optimization, so it was set aside. And then, gradually, over several generations, it was forgotten. Here is the open loop I set up at the beginning of this chapter. Now I am closing it. You were wondering how the unfamiliarity of field access could have been engineered without intention. The answer is this: the education system did not need to actively suppress anything. It simply needed to never teach it. An absence creates a habit as powerfully as a prohibition does. You do not miss the sense you were never told you had. Now, here is what suppressed does not mean. Suppressed does not mean gone. The library was always open. The field that ancient traditions called by different names, the Akashic record, the unified field, the ground of being, the infinite intelligence, was not stored in a school curriculum. It was never dependent on institutional permission for its existence. The capacity for generative access was not removed from you by bad education. It was simply buried under a thick layer of learned helplessness, a layer built by years of being told that the right answer lives outside you. And code is not magic. It is instruction. The wealthy code that older traditions passed down was never supernatural. It was a set of precise, repeatable practices for placing attention in a particular relationship with a particular quality of information, and then acting on that information with speed and confidence. The instruction still works. It works in the same way it worked in the libraries of Alexandria and the monasteries of 12th century France and the trading houses of medieval Persia. The method is ancient. The application is entirely current. What the industrial model produced was a specific kind of poverty that has nothing to do with money directly. It produced perceptual poverty. The inability to hear signals that are not delivered through officially sanctioned channels. You have spent your whole life being trained to wait for the right authority to tell you the answer. And the part of you that knows the answer before the authority speaks, that part was never destroyed. It was just never called on. It is being called on now. The industrial curriculum trained your attention outward. What you are relearning is how to point it inward and then outward again, not as a passive recipient of instruction, but as an active interpreter of something richer. That is not mystical. That is a skill. Skills can be learned at any age. They can be learned now. Further on, we will get to a point about how desire and receiving are related that pushes directly against the usual belief. Once that lands, it alters how you act every single morning. But for now, here is what this chapter leaves you with. The system that shaped your mind was not built to serve your wealth. It was built to serve a production model that required your compliance. Understanding that is not an invitation to resentment. Resentment is just another form of waiting for permission. Understanding that is an invitation to begin using your own intelligence on your own terms, which is exactly what the ancient practitioners did in every era that produced lasting wisdom. The door was never locked. You were just taught to stand outside and wait to be let in. Chapter 10. Accessing the record without a guru or a ritual. Right now, something is slipping past you, not loudly, not with any announcement. It moves the way water moves through a crack in stone, patient, continuous, and invisible until the damage is already done. What you are losing is not just money. It is access. Every day you wait for permission to enter a frequency of thinking you were told required special training, special teachers, special ceremonies. You are not standing still. You are drifting backward. The people who understand how this kind of deep, pattern-level intelligence works are already using it. They are making decisions from a place of clarity you have not yet touched, and that gap compounds. Not like debt exactly, more like a habit of looking the wrong direction. Each day of looking the wrong direction makes the right direction feel further away. Something caused this. A mechanism, invisible and old, placed the idea in your mind that access to your own deepest knowing required an intermediary. That mechanism is what this chapter dismantles, starting now. You were just taught to stand outside and wait to be let in. That sentence deserves a moment, because buried inside it is the whole problem. You were taught, meaning it is not natural, meaning someone decided you should believe that. And if someone decided you should believe you needed their permission, their ritual, their certification, their blessing, the first question worth asking is not how do I get initiated. The first question is who benefits from me believing I need initiation at all. Let that sit for a second before we move forward. Here is what the records actually require. Not ceremony, not lineage. Not a specific teacher with specific credentials passing a specific key across a specific threshold. The Akashic field, whatever language you prefer for the layer of intelligence that sits beneath ordinary thinking, responds to one condition and one condition only: coherence. A settled, focused, receptive state of attention where the noise of fear and performance drops away, and the signal beneath it becomes audible. That is the door. Coherence is the door. And you have walked through it before without realizing that was what you were doing. Picture the person you were before these last 3 years unfolded without polishing the memory. Not in terms of income or address. Think about a moment, even one where you sat somewhere quiet and something clear came to you. An idea. A direction. A sudden knowing that cut through everything you had been worrying about and landed with a certainty your analytical mind had not produced. You did not earn that moment through ritual. You arrived at it because the conditions were right. The noise was low. Your attention was present. You were coherent. That was the record speaking. You just did not have a name for it. Now here is the open question this chapter is going to carry. If you have accessed this before without knowing it, why have you not been able to access it on purpose? The answer involves something most people who teach Akashic practice will never say out loud. So hold that question. We will return to it. First, the 3 doors. The 3 specific entry points that replicate the conditions of coherence without requiring you to build an altar, locate a teacher, or memorize a script. Each one is practical. Each one is something you can do today. Each one has been used, some knowingly, some unknowingly, by people throughout history who accessed nonlinear intelligence and called it by different names. The first door is walking in nature, not hiking in a meditative practice sense, not a silent retreat, plain walking, outdoors, away from screens. What happens inside the brain during sustained rhythmic movement through a natural environment is not mystical. It is documented. The left hemisphere, the part responsible for linear problem solving, scheduling, social comparison, and the internal narrator that never stops talking, gradually reduces its dominance. The right hemisphere, which processes pattern, metaphor, spatial intelligence, and intuition, begins to have more room. The ratio shifts, And in that shift, something that was underneath the noise becomes available. Consider a woman named Daria. She worked for 12 years in a field she described as eating her from the inside out. Financial compliance. Technically skilled, well compensated, completely misaligned with everything she felt was possible for her life. She had tried therapy. She had read books. She had made lists. None of it produced the specific clarity she needed, not just what to change, but the actual direction to move. One spring, almost by accident, she started walking every morning. A park near her apartment. 40 minutes. No phone. No podcast. Just the movement and the trees and the sound of her own breathing. By the third week, something arrived that felt less like a thought and more like a knowing. She saw, without planning to see it, the exact intersection of her financial skills and a market that had been invisible to her before. She saw it whole. She did not have to build it piece by piece. It came as a complete image. 3 years after that walk became a daily practice, she ran a firm she had built from that single vision. She never called it Akashic. She called it her walking time. The name does not change what it was. After the walk, she never immediately reached for a phone or a task. She let the knowing settle. That part is not optional. The insight needs a few minutes of uninterrupted space, or the analytical mind will arrive and start arguing with it before it has finished forming. The second door is deep silence, and this one requires precision because most people misunderstand what silence actually means in this context. Silence does not mean the absence of sound. It means the suspension of internal narration. You can be in a perfectly quiet room and be producing more noise inside your skull than a crowded train station. The silence that opens the record is not environmental, it is attentional. It is the specific state that occurs when you stop predicting, stop rehearsing, stop explaining yourself to yourself, and simply rest your attention on what is present without labeling it. There is a practice simple enough to describe in under a minute. Sit. Close your eyes. Rather than focusing on breath or a mantra or any object, focus on the quality of silence itself. Not sound, not breath, the space between sounds, the gap. That gap is not empty. It feels empty because you are trained to find meaning only in content, but the gap is where coherence lives. 5 minutes of genuine attention on the gap, not thinking about the gap, attending to it, produces a state change that the most elaborate ceremonial preparation in the world is trying to produce. The ceremony is pointing at the gap. You can go directly to the gap. You do not need the ceremony to find it for you. This is the thing most teachers will not say out loud, because teachers need you to need them. That is not a cynical statement. It is a structural reality. If the access point is inside you and is reached through your own attention, there is no product to sell, no retreat to book, no lineage to join. The suppression of direct access is not always malicious. Sometimes it is simply the accumulated weight of institutions that formed around the insight and then mistook themselves for the insight. But suppressed does not mean gone. The library was always open. You just kept looking for a librarian before you would let yourself walk in. The third door is deliberate creative flow state. This one surprises people because it sounds more secular than the other two. But flow, the state that researchers began formally documenting in the 1980s, where a person is fully absorbed in a sufficiently challenging creative task, where time distorts and self-consciousness disappears, is not separate from what we are describing here. It is a specific neurological signature that closely mirrors the coherent state. The inner narrator goes quiet. The gap opens. And in that opening, nonlinear intelligence, pattern recognition, intuitive synthesis, the kind of knowing that cannot be assembled step by step, becomes active. The deliberate part is important. You do not wait for flow to find you. You create the conditions for it. A task that is genuinely interesting and mildly beyond your current comfort. A time block with no interruptions. The intention, held loosely, to let something arrive rather than manufacture it. When that state opens, do not immediately redirect it toward the problem you came in with. Let it move where it wants to move first. The record does not follow your agenda. It follows coherence. Once the coherence is established, you can introduce the specific question you are holding, about money, about direction, about a decision that has felt impossible, and something will arrive that did not come from your analytical processing. You have been in all three of these states before, many times. You just did not recognize them as the same door. Now, back to the question this chapter opened with. If you have accessed this before without knowing it, why have you not been able to access it on purpose? The answer is simpler and more frustrating than any conspiracy. You were never told it was yours. Every framework you encountered around this kind of intelligence presented it as something conferred by a teacher, by a tradition, by years of practice under supervision. So when clarity arrived naturally during a walk, you dismissed it as coincidence. When a knowing surfaced in a quiet moment, you called it your imagination and talked yourself out of it. When flow state delivered something precise and usable, you attributed it to luck and never tried to return to it deliberately. You were not blocked from the record. You were taught not to trust what came through when you accidentally opened it. That is the mechanism, not a hidden society, not deliberately encoded confusion. Just the steady, consistent social instruction that your own inner signal is not a reliable source of real intelligence about your life. That instruction protected a certain kind of power for a certain kind of institution, and it cost you something every single day you believed it. The code is not magic. It is instruction. The instruction is coherence, and coherence is not given to you by anyone who claims to hold it on your behalf. Soon, we will get to a point about where wealth intelligence originates that pushes directly against the usual belief. When that becomes clear, it alters not just how you think, but how you decide. For now, carry this. The record does not require initiation. It requires attention, quieted to the point where what was always underneath can finally be heard. The door was never locked. You were just told to keep waiting for a key. Chapter 11. The Wealth Code activates through contribution first. Giving money away before you have it is not sacrifice. It sounds like bad math, and you are right to question it. But here is the thing. Every person who has ever built something lasting, something that kept producing long after the initial effort was done, did not start by accumulating. They started by solving. They started by filling a gap that other people felt but could not name. The code does not activate when your account hits a number. It activates the moment your vision becomes larger than yourself. That is the counterintuitive truth sitting at the center of everything this book has been building toward. And if you have been waiting for the moment when the Akashic framework stops sounding philosophical and starts sounding like something you can actually use tomorrow morning, this is that moment. You were told to keep waiting for a key. That was the last thing this book said to you, and it was meant to land. Because you have been operating under an assumption so embedded you probably never examined it. The assumption that access comes after worthiness is proven, that wealth arrives as a reward for patience, that the field opens once you have done enough, waited enough, suffered enough. That is not how any of this works. Here is the open loop this chapter will answer before it ends. Why do some people with ordinary intelligence and modest resources produce extraordinary results, while people with more of everything produce less? Hold that question. The answer is stranger than the common version of the story. Think about a woman named 𝗡𝗢𝗧𝗘. She was 29 years old, working a government contract job in a mid-sized city. She made enough to survive, but not enough to feel free. She had read the books. She had done the visualization exercises. She had written her numbers on index cards and stuck them to her bathroom mirror. Every morning she looked at those numbers and felt something tighten in her chest. Not inspiration, a kind of low-grade dread. The numbers felt far away. They felt like a judgment she kept failing. After 18 months of this, she was no more financially free than when she started. She was just tired and a little embarrassed. Then she had a conversation with her neighbor, an older man named Desmond. He ran a small printing shop 2 blocks from her apartment. He had no index cards. He had no morning routine she could see, but his shop had been open for 22 years, had survived 3 recessions and a flood, and had recently expanded for the first time. 𝗡𝗢𝗧𝗘 asked him directly, what was his secret? Desmond was quiet for a moment. Then he said something she did not expect. He said he never once thought about what the shop would make. He thought about what the shop would do. He thought about the small business owners who could not afford a corporate print chain. He thought about the school plays that needed cheap programs and the family reunions that needed cheap banners. He thought about the gap, and he kept showing up to fill it. The money, he said, was just the score. It told him how well he was filling the gap. He never let the score become the game. 𝗡𝗢𝗧𝗘 went home and pulled the index cards off her mirror, not because the numbers were wrong, but because she understood for the first time that she had been playing the game backwards. Here is what the Akashic record system preserved through centuries of suppression, through the deliberate removal of non-linear wealth knowledge from the textbooks, the pulpits, and the financial planning offices. The field, and you can call it what you want, consciousness, information field, resonance system, the word matters far less than the structure. The field does not respond to want. It responds to function. It responds to what you are for, not to what you are after. Every tradition that carried this knowledge described wealth not as accumulation but as circulation. Not as a pool but as a current. The current does not benefit the person who dams it. The current benefits the person who directs it, and direction requires knowing where the water needs to go. This is not a spiritual abstraction. When you anchor your financial vision in what you will build for others, something structural changes in how you make decisions. You stop asking whether an opportunity will make you rich. You start asking whether an opportunity will solve something real. That shift is not emotional. It is mechanical. The person asking the second question has access to better information, makes fewer impulse errors, and builds things with longer lifespans. The field amplifies generative intentions not because the universe is cheering for altruists. It amplifies them because contribution is the architecture that produces durable value. And durable value is the only thing that generates compounding returns. Revisit the person you were before these last 3 years unfolded without polishing the memory. Not just financially, emotionally, in terms of what you believed was possible for you. Think about how you described your ambitions back then, if you described them at all. Were they mostly about what you would have? The apartment, the number in the account, the car, the version of your life that looked a certain way from the outside. There is nothing wrong with wanting those things, but ask yourself honestly whether chasing that picture has produced the traction you expected. Ask yourself whether the wanting has ever made the wanting stop. The code introduces a different grammar. It says, who do you serve and how specifically do you serve them? Not in a vague way. Not in the way a mission statement sounds on a company website. in the way a master craftsman understands what a tool needs to do before shaping the handle, in the way a doctor understands a patient's full history before deciding on a treatment. Specificity is not a detail in this system. Specificity is the activation point. The people whose wealth compounds, whose resources seem to multiply almost without effort after a certain threshold, are not people who got lucky. They are people who became indispensable to a specific group of other people. They closed a gap so precisely that the people whose gap was closed kept coming back, kept referring others, kept paying. The economy is just a word for the total sum of all those transactions. The person who serves precisely does not fight for market share. Market share finds them. Now here is where the chapter turns toward something you need to hear slowly. The Akashic field, the thing this book introduced as an ancient library outside you, a vast archive of all human knowledge and experience floating somewhere above or beyond your ordinary consciousness, that was a useful frame. It gave you a way to approach the information without the resistance that comes from more familiar language. But here is the seed of what Act 3 of this book will grow into fully. The library was never external. You did not gain access to an archive that exists somewhere else. What you have been doing through every chapter, through every principle and parable, is learning to read the archive that you already are. Let that sit for a moment. You are not a person trying to access an ancient field of intelligence. You are a node in that field. You carry within you the accumulated patterns of every transaction, every survival strategy, every act of creation and destruction your lineage ever enacted. When the record feels distant, it is not because the signal is weak. It is because the receiver has been tuned to the wrong frequency. And that frequency, scarcity, isolation, accumulation without direction, is the frequency that suppression installed. What contribution does is retune the receiver. When you orient your wealth vision outward, toward the specific human problem you exist to solve, you stop broadcasting static. You start transmitting on the channel the field has always been broadcasting back. Suppressed does not mean gone. That has been the quiet refrain of this entire book. The knowledge was hidden, not destroyed. The practices were outlawed, not erased. They survived in the margins of texts, in oral traditions, in the stubbornness of people who refused to believe that being poor was a moral condition. And what those practices always returned to, regardless of the cultural container they traveled through, was this. The wealth of any individual is inseparable from the health of the community that individual is part of, not as a moral ideal, as a functional observation. The community is the market. The community is the network. The community is the system of trust that makes any exchange possible. The person who strengthens that system gets stronger with it. The person who extracts from it without restoring it eventually loses the system itself. Now close the loop. Why do ordinary people with modest resources sometimes produce extraordinary results? Because they found a specific gap and filled it with everything they had. They did not split their attention between what they were building and what it would eventually get them. Their intelligence was not divided. It was entirely directed outward. And that direction created a clarity of execution that more resourced, more distracted competitors could not match. The code activated not because they were special. It activated because they were specific. And they were specific in service of something larger than their own comfort. Priya, if you are wondering, eventually closed the printing shop that Desmond retired from. She bought it from him at a fair price, spent 8 months understanding every client and every gap, and within 3 years had opened a second location. She still does not have index cards on her mirror. She has a wall where former clients pin thank you notes. She checks that wall on the mornings when the numbers feel heavy. It realigns her, not to the numbers but to the function. And the function, as always, takes care of the numbers. Later on, we will get to a point about where your authority actually comes from that pushes directly against the usual belief. After that clicks, it alters how you act every single morning. But for now, hold this. The code is not activated by asking the field for more. It is activated by offering the field more. When you cross that threshold from wanting to serving, from accumulating to generating, you do not just change your strategy. You change what you are. The archive does not give to those who take. It speaks through those who give. Chapter 12. You are not consulting the record, you are it. Every civilization that reached its peak of knowing left behind the same essential mark, not always in stone, not always in ink, but in the particular quality of thought that certain people carried in their bodies like a second skeleton. In every era, across every culture that built something lasting, there were people who accessed something that could not be fully taught and could not be fully taken away. They were not rare because the knowledge was scarce. They were rare because the knowledge was suppressed. Pushed to the edges, hidden in symbols, buried beneath newer systems designed to make you look outward for answers that live inward. That suppression never destroyed the source. Suppressed does not mean gone. Right now, with everything you have absorbed across the previous 11 chapters, you are standing at the exact place where that pattern closes on itself. The archive you have been learning to read is about to show you its most protected page, not because you found the right door, because you finally looked in the right direction. That line from the previous chapter is still settling. The archive does not give to those who take. It speaks through those who give. Sit with that for one more breath before moving forward. It contains the thread that will pull everything in this chapter open. Here is the open question to carry. If the archive speaks through you, what exactly are you? You have spent this entire book treating the Akashic field as something external, something to consult, something to approach with the right posture, the right practice, the right frequency. That framing was necessary. It gave you a structure to work within. It gave you a place to point your attention when your attention had nowhere useful to go. But structure is scaffolding, and scaffolding is never the building. Call up the person you were before these last 3 years unfolded without polishing the memory. Not the geography, not the job title. Think about the quality of knowing you brought to your own decisions. Think about the moments when you had a clear sense of something before you could explain why. A pull toward a certain direction. A sudden discomfort with something that looked fine on paper. A creative solution that arrived whole, not constructed piece by piece, but delivered all at once, like a sentence you didn't write but still knew by heart. Where did that come from? Not from a search engine, not from a mentor, not from logic working overtime. It came from somewhere in you that does not operate on the surface. That somewhere is not a metaphor. There was a woman named Saturate who worked in a city she had moved to with nothing but a folding table and a specific skill. She could look at a failing small business and see, within an hour, exactly what it was hiding from itself. Not what it was doing wrong, what it was hiding. The excess inventory that was really about the owner's fear of running out. The pricing that was too low because the owner had never believed the work was worth more. Saturate was not trained as a psychologist. She held no credentials in finance. What she had was a particular stillness in how she listened, and a habit she had developed years before. She called it clearing the front room. She would go quiet inside herself before any consultation, not to empty her mind, but to move the noisy, logical furniture out of the front room so that deeper knowing had space to speak. Her clients called her gifted. She never corrected them. She knew the word gift was a way for people to make something feel distant and unreachable, and she did not want them to feel that. But privately she understood something different. She was not accessing something outside herself. She had simply learned to stop drowning the signal with noise. Saren's clients paid her very well, and she gave very deliberately, not from guilt, not from strategy, from a felt sense that the circulation had to continue or the signal would tighten. The archive speaking through her required that she stay open. Staying open required that she remain in motion, in contribution, in exchange. The principle is the same for you. The code was never in a book on a shelf you couldn't reach. It was in every moment of genuine insight you ever had. Every time you knew something before you could explain it. Every time a creative answer appeared that your logical mind could not have constructed from available parts. That was not luck. That was the field speaking through you because you were momentarily available to it. Here is what was suppressed. Not the knowledge itself. You cannot suppress what lives inside human consciousness. What was suppressed was the instruction manual. The clear, direct, unsecreted teaching that says, you are not separate from the intelligence you are seeking. The system that wants you financially dependent, emotionally reactive, and epistemically anxious cannot survive if you know that. It needs you looking outward. It needs you purchasing access to things you already possess. The removal of this understanding from mainstream culture was not accidental, and it was not absolute. It shows up in fragments, in the edges of art and literature, in the stories people tell about their best decisions. But the full, direct, plain language version was carefully edged out. What you have been rebuilding across this entire book is that plain language version. Code is not magic. Code is instruction. And the instruction in its most compressed form is this. The library was always open because you were always inside it, not visiting it, not consulting it from outside. Inside it. The library, the field, is not a place you go. It is a dimension of what you already are, the expanded awareness that exists beneath your habitual thinking, beneath the noise of daily anxiety and financial fear, beneath the stories about being behind, the comparisons, the scarcity math. Beneath all of that, there is a layer of knowing that has never been confused. That layer has always had access to nonlinear solutions, to wealth patterns that do not follow conventional logic, to the specific quality of insight that Saren called clearing the front room. That layer is you, not a better version of you, not a future version. You right now minus the interference. This is where the reversal closes. 11 chapters of approaching the field as external architecture, and now the architecture reveals itself as your own expanded structure. You were never a visitor to the library. You were always one of the walls. So what changes now? Everything that was effort becomes recognition. Every practice you were given earlier in this book was not a method for reaching something far away. It was a method for removing what was in the way. The breathing, the clearing, the contribution without grasping, none of it was transportation. All of it was excavation. The question you have been carrying since near the beginning of this chapter, if the archive speaks through you, what exactly are you, has its answer now. You are the record, not a copy of it, not a student of it. The living, walking, deciding, choosing, contributing record of an intelligence that has never been absent from your life for a single day. That is not a comfort offered at the end of a long road. It is a fact that changes every road you walk from here. The only question left is whether you will keep treating it like a place you visit, or whether you will finally start living like someone who knows the library never closed. Chapter 13. Ancient wealth holders were people like you. You have done the reading. You have sat with the ideas. You have felt more than once that something in this material was real, not metaphor, not self-help theater, something that pointed at an actual mechanism. And then, almost on schedule, a quieter voice arrived. It said something like, "This was meant for someone else." The people who actually accessed this kind of knowledge were different from you, exceptional in some way you cannot name but can feel, gifted with a capacity you were not issued. That voice did not argue with the ideas. It simply suggested, politely and persistently, that the ideas were not yours to use. That voice is the subject of this chapter. It is lying to you. The lie has a specific shape. And once you see the shape, you will not be able to unsee it. Living as someone who knows the library never closed is not a poetic choice. It is a practical one, and it starts with understanding who exactly kept that library alive. Here is the open question this chapter will carry for a while before answering it fully. If the people who held this knowledge throughout history were ordinary, why did history present them as extraordinary? Hold that. The answer matters more than you expect. Nikola Tesla was not wealthy by conventional measures for most of his life. He died with almost nothing in a New York hotel room. By the standard ledger, he lost. But listen to what he said about where his ideas came from. He did not describe a laboratory process. He described a reception process. He said that his inventions arrived whole, that he would see a device fully formed before he built it, that the act of construction was almost secondary to the act of receiving. He called it tapping into the universe's existing intelligence. He was not speaking in metaphor. He meant it as a technical description of his actual experience. Here is what most people do with that information. They file it under genius. They say, Tesla was exceptional, therefore his process was exceptional, therefore it does not apply to me. And they move on. That filing is the error. Tesla's process was not exceptional. His willingness to trust it was. Bring to mind the person you were before these last 3 years unfolded without polishing the memory. Not geographically, internally. What did you believe you were capable of earning, building, creating? How many of those beliefs have already been proven wrong by your own experience, not by someone else's encouragement, but by what you actually did? The ceiling you were certain was fixed has already moved at least once, probably more than once, and you still carry the memory of the old ceiling like it is current information. That is not weakness. That is the natural result of receiving a truncated map. A man named Elias Vance worked as a shipping clerk in Philadelphia in the early 1900s. Not famous. No recorded genius. He spent his evenings reading not popular literature but older texts, translated poorly, passed hand to hand through a small network of people who believed that the mainstream economics of their era was missing something structural. Elias did not invent a product. He did not discover a formula. He reorganized how he thought about value. He stopped asking what he could earn. He started asking what he could perceive that others, working from the truncated map, were systematically missing. Within 6 years, he had built a small distribution business that outlasted 3 larger competitors, not because he had better data, because he was asking a different category of question. He left no famous quotes. He left a business that ran quietly and prosperously for decades, and a private journal that described his method as learning to read what is already written. The library was already open. Elias just walked in. The Akashic wealth tradition, the framework this book has been tracing through history, across cultures, through the gaps left by deliberate removal, was not carried by gods. It was not preserved by geniuses. It was held by people like Elias. People who refused, for reasons sometimes practical and sometimes instinctive, to accept that the map they were handed was complete. That refusal is the entry point. Not talent, not lineage, not a special attunement most people lack. Refusal. And here is where the open question returns. Why did history dress these people in robes and halos? Why did the tradition get wrapped in mysticism so thick that ordinary people would self-select out of it before they even engaged? Because a framework that teaches you to generate wealth through perception, pattern recognition, and non-linear connection is genuinely dangerous to systems that depend on scarcity compliance. Wrap it in ritual. Call its holders chosen. Make the entry requirement feel like a bloodline or a gift from the heavens. Most people will stop at the door. Not because they are unable to enter, because they have been handed a story in which they are not the type of person who enters. That story is the mechanism of exclusion, not the knowledge itself. The code is not magic. It never was. It is instruction that operates at a level of intelligence the truncated map does not acknowledge exists. When Tesla received a device hole, he was using a cognitive capacity that every human being carries. When Elias read demand patterns before they appeared in data, he was doing the same thing. The capacity is not rare. The permission is. You have been waiting, somewhere underneath all of this reading and reflection, for permission. Permission to take the framework seriously as something that applies to you specifically. Permission to stop treating the library as a place for other kinds of people. That permission cannot come from outside. It has never come from outside for anyone who actually accessed this knowledge. Tesla did not wait for the scientific establishment to validate his reception process. Elias did not wait for Philadelphia's business community to confirm his method. They simply proceeded. Proceeding is what this chapter is asking of you. Not faith in something mystical, not a leap across a canyon of doubt. A precise, grounded decision to stop filing yourself under the category of exception. The ancient holders of this knowledge were not exceptional people with ordinary limitations who somehow transcended those limitations through special gifts. They were ordinary people with ordinary doubts who made one specific choice. They refused the truncated map. That is the whole of the exceptionalism. Nothing more. The Akashic wealth framework has survived suppression, mistranslation, deliberate burial, and centuries of institutional ridicule. It survived because people like Elias kept passing it forward. People with no titles, no platforms, no formal authority. Just the stubborn clarity that what they had learned was real and that someone else needed to receive it. You are here because that chain held. The question the final chapter of this book will answer is not whether the framework is accessible to you. That question is already answered. The question is what you do now that you know the library never belonged to anyone but you. The wealth code was never held by gods. It was held by people who stopped believing they were not the kind of person it was meant for. Chapter 14. The code was never hidden from you, only from your fear. Every civilization that has ever risen left behind the same quiet evidence. In the oldest texts, carved into stone or pressed into clay or folded into bark, there is a recurring instruction, not a prayer, not a myth, a working principle for how a human being can align with the conditions that produce prosperity. The language changes. The symbols change. The priests and philosophers and wandering teachers who carried these ideas change, but the instruction itself does not. Somewhere in that long, unbroken lineage you arrived, not by accident. You have been circling this knowledge your entire life, getting close and then retreating, recognizing something at the edge of your awareness without quite being able to name it. This chapter is where the circling stops. What you are about to receive is not a final secret withheld until now. It is a clarity that becomes possible only after everything you have already moved through in this book. You have done the work. This is what it earns you. The last chapter left you with a specific idea. The wealth code was never held by gods. It was held by people who stopped believing they were not the kind of person it was meant for. Sit with that for just a moment before moving forward. Hidden inside that sentence is the question this entire book has been quietly building toward. If the code was always held by people, ordinary people who simply stopped disqualifying themselves, then why did it feel hidden from you? Why did it take this long? Here is the open question, and you deserve a real answer. Not a comfortable one, a true one. The library was always open. That is the phrase that has woven itself through every chapter, every principle, every story you have encountered here. The Akashic field, introduced early in this book as something vast and external, some cosmic archive you had to petition or decode or earn access to, has been revealing itself in stages as something else entirely. It is not outside you. It never was. The field is what happens when your own consciousness stops contracting around fear and begins to operate from its full capacity. The archive is your own expanded awareness. The library is not a place you travel to. It is a state you inhabit. And here is what makes this sting just slightly, because it is supposed to. The library was never locked against you. The door was never bolted by enemies or institutions or shadowy forces, though those forces are real, and their preference for keeping scarcity thinking dominant is real. The suppression was real, but suppression is not the same as elimination. A river can be dammed, but the water does not stop being water. The code persisted. It circulated through alternative channels, through tradition and practice, and the stubborn insistence of people who refused to accept that wealth intelligence was only for the appointed few. Go back to the person you were before these last 3 years unfolded without polishing the memory. Not in general terms. Specifically, what did your bank account look like at this time 3 years ago? What did you believe, down in the quiet parts of yourself, about what you were allowed to have? About what people like you from your background, with your particular history of financial close calls and near misses and months where the math simply did not work out, were realistically able to build. You had a number. You had a ceiling. You probably did not know it was a ceiling because it felt like the floor. That version of you could have read every word of this book and absorbed almost none of it. Not because you were not intelligent, not because you were not ready to work, but because fear is not a belief you hold. Fear is a filter the mind runs all incoming information through. Anything that contradicts the fear gets reclassified as naive or unrealistic or meant for someone else. The library was open. But the fear told you the books inside were written in a language you were not equipped to read. So you stood at the threshold and turned back, and the library waited. This is the revelation this book has been building toward since its first page. Nothing was suppressed from you specifically. The broader suppression exists, yes, but your particular experience of not having access to wealth-building intelligence was not primarily the result of external forces. It was the result of a scarcity state that functioned as a perceptual wall. When the wall is fear, you do not need someone to lock the door. You lock it yourself from the inside every morning without even noticing. And now something has shifted. You can feel it even if you cannot name it precisely. The shift is not dramatic. It does not announce itself with noise. It is quiet, the way a key turning in a lock is quiet, the way morning comes in without asking permission. You have been reading and listening and sitting with these principles long enough that the filter has begun to thin. The scarcity state that made the library invisible has been, chapter by chapter, quietly dismantled, not destroyed, not permanently banished, but made conscious. And a fear you can see is a fear you can choose not to obey. There is one more thing left to do, and it is practical, not mystical. Tomorrow morning, before you check your phone, before you look at your messages or your account balance or anything that the outside world is preparing to demand of you, you are going to do something very specific. Sit for 5 minutes, not meditating, not visualizing, not performing any ritual, just sitting with your feet flat on the floor and your hands open in your lap. In that 5 minutes, ask yourself one question. Ask it plainly, without pressure, without desperation. Ask, what does the clearest part of me already know about what to do next? Not what is safe, not what is guaranteed. What does the clearest part of me already know? Then listen, not for a voice, not for a vision. Listen for the quiet information that surfaces when fear is not crowding the room. It will come as a thought that feels slightly too obvious, or slightly too bold, or slightly too much like something you have been quietly aware of for months but have been explaining away. That thought is the code activating. That is the library speaking in the only language it has ever used, your own native intelligence freed from the noise of scarcity. This is not magic, it is instruction. The distinction matters. Magic asks you to believe in something external performing on your behalf. Instruction asks you to act on what you already have access to. The code is instruction. It always was. You came to this book carrying a particular weight, the feeling of being behind. The suspicion that the rules that seemed to work for other people were somehow not applying to you. The exhausting, grinding sense that no matter how hard you worked, the distance between where you were and where you needed to be was not closing fast enough. That weight was real. The conditions that created it were real. But underneath the weight, something else was also real. Something steady and quiet that has been waiting for exactly this moment. The loop closes here. The question that opened in the first pages of this book, whether the code was ever truly available to someone in your exact position, is answered now. Not with a promise, with a fact. The library was always open. The reading was always possible. What changed was you. You are not the same person who started this book. Close it knowing that. Not with celebration, not with a plan, not with anything loud. Close it the way you close a door on a room you no longer need to live in, quietly, with full awareness of what you are leaving behind. The library was always open. Now so are you.